Welcome to this collector's item for any true supporter of Tottenham Hotspur Football Club. A celebration of great FA Cup memories from the 60s to the present day. The players and the moments which have always made this a special competition for the club. We start with the glory years and some of the heroes of the 60s and early 70s, a time when Tottenham Hotspur was synonymous with style and success. One man in the modern era to epitomise Tottenham Hotspur, it's Steve Perryman. He joined the club the day after the 1967 FA Cup final success, signing professional terms in 1969. But Perryman was unaware that he would one day break the club record for league appearances with 655. As a youngster, Perryman very much had the babyface look about him, but he showed terrific energy all over the pitch, complementing the flair players in the early 70s in the Tottenham lineup. Perryman saw highs and lows with Tottenham in that era, winning domestic and European trophies in the early part of the decade, but subjected to relegation in 1977. As Spurs bounced back at the first attempt, Perryman was firmly established as captain, and the good times came rolling back. In '81, Perryman, now playing at right back, collected the FA Cup after an epic final against Manchester City, emulating Danny Blanchflower a year later by lifting it once more. Perryman remains a Tottenham legend and one of the nicest men to grace English football. Some players are born with natural talent, and Tottenham Hotspur were blessed to have Glenn Hoddle at White Hart Lane. The most gifted midfielder of his generation, playing for the team he supported was a dream come true for Hoddle. He scored on his debut as a 17-year-old against Peter Shilton at Stoke in 1975. And from that moment on, he entertained the crowd with his sublime control, vision and magnetic range of passing. His introduction into first-team life was tough in the post-Bill Nicholson era, as Tottenham struggled in the mid to late 1970s. But Hoddle was the one remaining light, and the arrival of Ardiaz and Villa in 1978 helped his talent to blossom, as the White Hart Lane faithful were treated to one of the most creative midfields in the country. With the addition of Steve Archibald and Garth Crooks up front in 1980, the chances were turned into goals week in, week out, as Tottenham's forward line benefited from a variety of Hoddle assists. Manager Keith Birkinshaw built the Spurs side of the early 80s around a man adored at Tottenham, but always having to prove himself on the international stage. It wasn't until his England career ended that most observers felt he should have had more than 53 caps. Having been instrumental in the 1981 FA Cup success, Hoddle scored in both games in the final a year later, as his penalty helped Spurs retain the trophy. Many felt Hoddle would suit the foreign game, but it wasn't until 1987 when he finally left Spurs to join Monaco, after making his last appearance for Tottenham in yet another FA Cup final against Coventry. Despite recent disappointments as a manager, when many hoped he would be the returning Messiah, Hoddle remains close to the heart of Tottenham fans, and in the modern era, he is considered the king of White Hart Lane. Chris Hughton made his debut for Spurs in a League Cup tie against Manchester United in August 1979, just 2 months after signing professional terms for the club. The promising fullback had been part-time for 2 years while completing an apprenticeship as a lift engineer. International honours quickly followed for Hughton, who was qualified to play for the Republic of Ireland on his mother's side. Having previously started out as a winger, he became a defender with an eye for going forward to good effect, always available and dangerous when running with the ball. By the time of the successful early 80s Spurs side, Hughton had made the left-back spot his own, and he won 2 FA Cup medals and the UEFA Cup in 1984. After winding down his playing career at West Ham, Hughton went on to forge a successful coaching career at Tottenham and with the Republic of Ireland. Tony Galvin took an unusual route to White Hart Lane, deciding to become a professional player only after he'd completed a Bachelor of Arts degree in Russian Studies and concluded a teacher training course. He was spotted playing for non-league Gould Town and signed for Tottenham in January 1978, but he didn't become a full-time professional until the summer of that year when his studies were finished. Galvin made his league debut in 1979, but it wasn't until an FA Cup third-round replay against QPR in '81 that his chance came to cement his place in the first team. His emergence that year as a talented winger was vital to Spurs' success throughout the early '80s. He had the ability to carry the ball from deep positions. He could beat defenders and deliver precise crosses. His style of play, a fine foil to the dexterous talents of Hoddle and Ardiles. And he was a valuable part of the team that won the FA Cup in 1981 and '82. In that year, he also collected a League Cup runners-up medal. He was an outstanding member of the '84 UEFA Cup winning side, the pinnacle of a successful period for the club. The Republic of Ireland also benefited from Galvin's talent. He picked up 30 international caps, 20 of them while a Spurs player. Argentina's midfield maestro Osvaldo Ardiles rose to prominence with dazzling performances in the 1978 World Cup, and it was soon after this that Tottenham pulled off a sensational double signing of Ardiles and his compatriot Ricardo Villa. Although standing a mere 5'6" tall and weighing only 10 stones, Ardiles soon adapted to the robust nature of the English game. He had the uncanny ability to ride challenges and hold off bigger and less dexterous opponents. His silky Latin skills and his intelligent, charming persona quickly made him a firm favourite with the Spurs fans. In '81, Ozzy's virtuoso performances played a central part in helping Tottenham lift the FA Cup for the first time in 14 years. And but for a combination of international duty and the Falklands conflict, he would surely have been part of that successful team that defended the Cup the following year against QPR. The combination of the political tension between England and Argentina, coupled with some lengthy injury layoffs, meant Ardiles spent the next few seasons out of the limelight, though he did collect a UEFA Cup winners' medal after playing as a substitute in the second leg of the final against Anderlecht in 1984. But in typically humble fashion, he didn't keep his medal for long, handing it to Spurs' stalwart captain Steve Perryman, who had missed the match due to suspension. In '87, he was back to his best, once again helping Tottenham to the FA Cup final, though this time, sadly, it ended in defeat at the hands of Coventry. In '91, Ozzy left White Hart Lane to join QPR, but he then returned to manage the club that he'd given the best years of his playing days to. And even now, Osvaldo Ardiles remains a true Tottenham legend. When Tottenham sensationally signed Ardiles in the summer of 1978, the World Cup star politely inquired if his mate Ricky could come too. Manager Keith Birkinshaw couldn't believe his luck, and the tall, bearded midfielder would go on to make his own contribution to Spurs folklore. The Argentinian scored on his debut at Nottingham Forest as the 78-79 campaign started with a frenzy down Tottenham High Road. Fans flocking to see Villa team up with Ardiles and Hoddle in a new-look, exciting midfield as the club returned from one season in Division 2. Despite his great technical skill, Villa had to live in the shadow of his compatriot until the FA Cup run of 1981, and fate would then swing in his favour. He was taken off in the first match against Manchester City in the final at Wembley, but a tearful Villa was told he would be back in the side for the replay. So 5 days later, having scored early on, he set off on a run that resulted in one of the finest goals Wembley had seen. It brought the FA Cup back to White Hart Lane for the first time since 1967. The following season, England proved to be the wrong place for an Argentinian to be playing his football. The outbreak of the Falklands War cruelly denied Villa and Ardiles their chance to play their part in Spurs' quest for 4 trophies. In the end, the club had to settle for retaining the FA Cup, and it wasn't until the morning of the match that Birkinshaw felt he had to leave Villa out. He returned briefly the following season. It was increasingly difficult for Villa to stay in the English game, but his legacy remains from a warm May evening at Wembley and that glory, glory night. Perhaps unfortunately for Mickey Hazard, he was at Tottenham at the same time as Glenn Hoddle. This exceptionally gifted midfield playmaker often found himself second choice, as Hoddle continued to steal the limelight. But there was no doubting this player's ability. Superb passing range, delicate close ball control, making Hazard a tricky opponent for the most seasoned of defenders, and he also had the enviable knack of scoring crucial goals. In the 1981-82 season, Hazard seized the chance for more appearances with the unfortunate omission of Spurs' Argentinian contingent, and he started in both games in the 82 FA Cup final against Queen's Park Rangers. By the time of the 84 UEFA Cup run, Hazard was proving invaluable in the absence of the injured Hoddle, scoring the decisive goal in the semi-final against Hajduk Split and playing a key role in the ultimately triumphant final against Anderlecht. Despite more key performances during the 84-85 season, when Spurs came close to winning the league in a duel with Everton, Hazard was still resigned to the bench when everyone was available, and manager Peter Shreeves let him leave for Chelsea in September of 1985. An unexpected return came 8 years later though, as Ossie Ardiles brought Hazard back to White Hart Lane for the twilight of his career, pleasing both the player and the fans. Arriving from non-league Weymouth in 1980, Graham Roberts seized his chance at the big time and saw a meteoric rise in his first season, ending with FA Cup final glory in May 1981. Roberts literally put everything into every challenge, in every match he played for Spurs, becoming a big crowd favourite and helping to shore up a defence famed for conceding soft goals. Alongside Paul Miller, Roberts helped Spurs begin an era in the early 80s when the team was as good as any in the country. Buoyed by the 81 Cup success, Spurs set out on a four-pronged attack on more silverware, and Roberts got better in every match. But with too many games in hand to physically cope with, Spurs would finish fourth in the league, runners-up in the League Cup and semi-finalists in the Cup Winners' Cup. The FA Cup, however, was retained at Wembley against Queen's Park Rangers in 82, Roberts playing an influential midfield role, one he'd been asked to play many times during that season. A tired Spurs side held out to win in the replay, and Roberts was arguably the best player across the two games. But his greatest moment came in May 84, with Steve Perryman suspended for the UEFA Cup final second leg against Anderlecht. He captained the side, and Roberts equalised with 7 minutes left to save the tie before scoring one of the successful penalties in the shootout and lifting the trophy at White Hart Lane. An inspirational player who also won 6 England caps, Roberts left Spurs in 1986 when Graham Souness convinced him to join the Rangers Renaissance in Scotland. Former Rolls-Royce mechanic Steve Archibald joined Tottenham from Scottish champions Aberdeen in May 1980. The transfer fee of £800,000 was then a record between English and Scottish clubs. This Scottish under-23 international settled into life in North London quickly, forming a prolific strike partnership with Garth Crooks, and honours didn't take long to arrive. In 81, Archibald won his first medal with Spurs as they overcame Manchester City in the FA Cup final replay with a 3-2 victory. The following season saw a successful Tottenham team retain the FA Cup as well as finishing as runners-up in the League Cup. The 83-84 season was Archibald's last at Spurs, and despite barely being on speaking terms with manager Keith Birkinshaw, it was probably his best. Spurs had struggled to find any kind of form on the domestic front, but in Europe it was a different story. Archibald hit 5 goals in the UEFA Cup run, that climaxed in a nail-biting penalty shootout victory over Anderlecht in the final. It took his goal tally for the season to 28, the best in his Spurs career. Soon after, European giants Barcelona came looking for the talents of Archibald, an offer he simply couldn't refuse. Tottenham's 1980 signing of Stoke striker Garth Crooks was something of a masterstroke by manager Keith Birkinshaw. The partnership he created by pairing Crooks with Steve Archibald led to one of the most potent and exciting strike combinations in the club's history. Crooks was a goal poacher, a natural opportunist, but also unselfish and responsible for creating many goals for those around him. He possessed excellent balance and ball control, which he would use to torment defences. He was strong on the ball and able to withstand the rough treatment dished out by heavy-handed defenders. He also had a sweet left foot, which spelt danger for opponents in and around the box. His early years at the club were the most successful. As an ever-present part of the team that lifted the FA Cup in 1981 and then retained it in 82, he sealed his place in Spurs history books. A crucial equaliser in the 81 FA Cup final replay was undoubtedly one of his most important goals, though it would be overshadowed by that wonder strike from Villa. After a loan spell at Manchester United, Crooks left Tottenham in 1985 to join West Bromwich Albion. Nowadays, he's one of many former Spurs stars to ply their trade in the media. Former Liverpool keeper Ray Clements had already won nearly every honour in the game by the time he joined Tottenham. As part of the dominating Anfield side of the 70s, he notched up winners' medals season after season, but he was still hungry for more success. In Clements, Spurs finally found a keeper to replace the legacy left by Pat Jennings. Gifted with exceptionally fast reflexes and a sound positional sense, Clements inspired confidence among his defenders, and it carried right through the team. He was seemingly unflappable and always cool, calm and collected. Truly, Clements was a giant between the sticks. In his first season, he carried on his winning habit by helping Spurs retain the FA Cup as well as reaching the League Cup final. He and Spurs would have to wait 5 years before returning to Wembley in an FA Cup final, but unfortunately this time it would be on the losing side after that thrilling game against Coventry. Clements was undoubtedly one of the best keepers England ever produced, but his friendly rivalry with Peter Shilton meant for a long time they would share the position for the England team. Clements was looking like he would emulate Jennings and Shilton by playing on into his 40s, but due to a serious knee injury in 1987, he was forced to call time on a glittering career. His achievements in the game were recognised with an MBE, and after serving as Spurs joint head coach alongside Doug Livermore, he remained in the England camp as goalkeeping coach. When Gary Mabbutt signed for Spurs at the start of the 1982-83 season from hometown Bristol Rovers, he thought he'd have to bide his time, breaking into a team full of superstars. But not only was he in the lineup for the first match, but he scored on his debut, and within 2 months he was playing for England. It's often overlooked that Mabbutt is in fact a diabetic. Such was the energy he displayed in midfield. He also had a goal-scoring knack in that first season, often playing up front. But it was in the centre-back role that Mabbutt finally established himself as David Pleat took over in 1986. Scoring at both ends in the FA Cup final in '87 was soon forgotten, as he was made club captain on the departure of Richard Gough in the following season, and he remained in that role until his final game in May 1998. One of football's true gentlemen, Mabbutt gave everything to Tottenham over 16 years, the pinnacle coming at Wembley in 1991 as he lifted the FA Cup to erase the disappointment of 4 years previously. He amassed over 600 appearances for Tottenham, and Mabbutt's remembered as a perfect ambassador for the sport he gave so much to. When Tottenham Hotspur paid £700,000 to Queen's Park Rangers in August 1984 for Clive Allen, the 23-year-old striker was following in his father's footsteps. Les had been a regular in the famous 1960-61 all-conquering double team. Peter Shreve's new signing had a frustrating time with injuries in his first 2 seasons, but showed glimpses of the clinical finishing that would become his trademark. Although Allen managed only 15 appearances in his opening season, he weighed in with a creditable return of 8 goals. By the time of the 86-87 campaign, Allen started the season with an opening day hat-trick at Aston Villa and never looked back. With players of the calibre of Ozzy Ardiles, Chris Waddle and Glenn Hoddle to carve out the opportunities, Clive was in dreamland. In the 87 FA Cup campaign, Spurs made it all the way to the final against Coventry, with Allen netting 3 times on the road to Wembley. In the final itself, he it was that got Spurs off to a dream start by heading them in front after just 2 minutes. Despite losing that final, the season was still a personal success for this prolific striker, as he finished with an incredible 49-goal haul. In March 1988, after playing 156 competitive games and scoring 112 times for Spurs, he was sold to Bordeaux for a fee of £1 million. Chris Waddle was a Tottenham Hotspur player waiting to happen. Impressing at his hometown Newcastle United in the early 80s, Spurs knew that they simply had to buy him. With deceptive pace, sublime control and that creative spark, the White Hart Lane faithful had to wait a few months to see the best of Waddle. But halfway through his first season, in 1985-86, he came alive and never stopped being a top attraction at this time in London. When David Pleat took over from Peter Shreves in 1986, Waddle continued to flourish, a key performer in the famous 5-man midfield that supplied Clive Allen with so many goals. By now a consistent England player, the man who used to work in a sausage factory was making mincemeat out of defences with classic wing wizardry, a throwback to former times. Often looking tired and lazy, a quick drop of the shoulder and he was away. After the departure of teammate and sometimes singing star Glenn Hoddle, the Spurs fans hailed their remaining Diamond Light as the new king of White Hart Lane. With Terry Venables now in charge, Waddle was the creative linchpin, forming a telepathic understanding with fellow Geordie Paul Gascoigne on his arrival from the northeast. Having signed a 7-year contract in 1989 to remain at Tottenham for the rest of his career, Waddle became the first victim of the financial trouble that loomed at White Hart Lane as he was sensationally sold to Marseille for £4.25 million. His last season at the club was the most prolific. He scored 14 goals and almost single-handedly won several matches. Waddle remains one of the true Tottenham greats. When midfielder Paul Allen joined Tottenham from West Ham United in 1985, he became the third member of the Allen clan to play for the North London Giants. Cousin Clive and Uncle Les had both already donned the famous white shirt of Tottenham. By the time he arrived at White Hart Lane, Paul already held the record of being the youngest player ever to appear in an FA Cup final as a member of the West Ham team that beat Arsenal in 1980. He gradually established himself as an integral part of the Tottenham squad with his tireless and dependable displays. A versatile midfielder who could also drop into the role of fullback when required, what he lacked in flair and skill, he more than made up for with a will to win and commitment to the cause. In 1987, Paul made a second appearance in the FA Cup final, this time against Coventry, but after the thrilling climax of extra time, he'd have to be content with a loser's medal this time. 4 years later, though, he was back at Wembley again, a 2-1 victory over Nottingham Forest, securing Allen his second FA Cup winners' medal and his place in the Tottenham Hotspur history books. As a youngster, David Howells made his Tottenham debut in 1986 at Sheffield Wednesday and got himself on the score sheet, but he had to wait another 2.5 years before reappearing in the first team, this time under Terry Venables. And it was Venables who turned Howells from a youth team striker to a holding midfield player, a move that would prove fruitful as he became a fixture in the Tottenham team during the 1990s. In the 1991 campaign, Howells was at his peak, providing the defensive stability in a midfield including Paul Gascoigne. In the semi-final and final of the FA Cup, he was deployed tactically to stifle the opposition, and it worked a treat as Tottenham ended the campaign with silverware. Tottenham had their fair share of ups and downs in Howells' time at the club, but they had him to thank at the end of the 93-94 season as he got the goal at Oldham Athletic to seal survival in the Premier League after a season that almost ended in relegation. Howells gave a decade's service to Spurs, and he rightfully claimed a testimonial in 1997 in his last season at the club before joining Southampton on a free transfer. Having first been at Tottenham as an uncompromising young defender, Terry Venables couldn't find room for Neil Ruddock in the first team as doubts over his fitness persisted. He sold him to Millwall in 1988. 4 years on, and with Ruddock now at Southampton, Venables was desperate to bring him back to White Hart Lane to build a defence around him. With some doubts over his temperament and a physical style of play, the man who liked to be known as Razor was faultless on his return, captaining the club he'd supported as a boy on the opening day of the newly formed Premier League. It turned into an inspirational campaign for Ruddock, He proved to be the rock at the heart of a back four alongside Gary Mabbutt, as Spurs overcame a poor start to the season to finish 8th, narrowly missing out on the FA Cup final. In addition to considerable raw natural strength, Ruddock was also skillful on the ball and dangerous at set pieces, whether with head or his trusty left foot. Spurs fans thought their newfound hero was here to stay long-term, continuing the tradition of men to grace the number 6 shirt. He was hoping for a new deal, but in the Alan Sugar, Terry Venables fallout, Ruddock was one of the few players to publicly announce allegiance to El Tel. Incoming manager Ozzy Ardiles tried to keep Ruddock, but too much damage had been done, and Liverpool came in for a player who should have remained at White Hart Lane for years. When Vinnie Samways broke into the Tottenham first team in 1987, he was seen as a natural successor to Ozzy Ardiles, who was coming to the end of his Spurs career. With exceptional ball control and creativity, many thought that England honours would one day come his way. Having to settle for under-21 caps, Samways still became a first-team regular by the 1988-89 season, as Terry Venables' faith in a young side began to pay off. Perhaps Samways' single best display came in the famous win against Arsenal in the 1991 FA Cup semi-final. He enjoyed his part in a 5-man midfield and played the counter-attacking role to perfection. A month later, he repeated the dose in the final itself, showing growing maturity with the injured Paul Gascoigne off the field. Samways was now playing in the style expected at White Hart Lane, as this East End boy grew in confidence with every match. Spurs almost returned to the FA Cup final in 92-93, as Samways again played his part in a new-look diamond formation. But in the summer of 94, with midfield spaces now at a premium, he was sold to Everton, sadly never quite managing to recapture the same form at Goodison Park. In the summer of 1988, Paul Stewart arrived at White Hart Lane at the same time as Paul Gascoigne, and the two would soon strike up a close partnership on the field and off it. At Manchester City, Stewart had been prolific in Division 2, becoming one of the country's hottest young strikers, showing enough promise for Terry Venables to make the plunge into the transfer market. Having come on for a debut against Manchester United to win and then miss a penalty, it took a few weeks for Stewart to find his feet, but soon his aggressive style was causing top-flight defenders plenty of problems. A permanent fixture in the Spurs side at the turn of the 90s, there was one match that would unwittingly prove a masterstroke. Down to 9 men against Luton in 1990, Stewart dropped into midfield to show extra guile, yet score twice in a famous win. And from that point on, he stayed in this new position, showing qualities many hadn't known existed, as Tottenham finished the season at Wembley. In the 1991 FA Cup final itself against Nottingham Forest, Stewart was the man of the match, as Spurs came to terms with Paul Gascoigne's self-destruction early in the game. After scoring the equaliser, everything he tried came off, and he was the backbone of the team, as victory was Tottenham's. After another faultless season in 91-92 and a solitary England cap, Graham Souness came knocking on the door, and as the Premier League started, Stewart was a Liverpool player. His contribution to the last Spurs FA Cup win is not forgotten at White Hart Lane, though. In 1988, Terry Venables took his Spurs team to Newcastle, and he saw them destroyed by a young Paul Gascoigne. After that, he knew he had to sign him, and in the summer of that year, he broke the transfer record to prize him away from St James's Park for £2 million. After ironically making his debut back on Tyneside, Gascoigne proved a smash hit pretty much from the start. Spurs fans have always longed for the ultimate entertainer. Now they had the best around. With a cheeky grin, an infectious character and incredible self-confidence, Gazza grew with every match in his first season at White Hart Lane, absorbing the media attention that would eventually consume him. The following season had the prize of a World Cup place to play for. And Gascoigne improved further to convince Bobby Robson of his place in the national side, as Spurs finished an impressive third in the league. Italia 90 was the defining moment of Gascoigne's career. He was one of the stars of the tournament, and his tears at the end of the semi-final against West Germany remain an image of a generation. On his return, Gazza Mania kicked off big time. On the pitch was where the Geordie was safest. He still produced match-winning displays, and if only for 90 minutes, the press couldn't get to him. Gascoigne almost single-handedly took Spurs to the FA Cup final in 1991. His contribution to the downfall of rivals Arsenal in the semi-final, now legendary. But he self-destructed early in the first half of the final, and with a move to Lazio already pending, he would never play for Spurs again. Taking a year to recover from knee ligament damage, the Italians finally got their man. But there's no doubt that in a career that eventually took him back to England via Scotland, Spurs fans saw the best of the icon that is Paul Gascoigne. Moroccan-born Mohamed Ali Amar, more commonly known as Naeem, originally brought on loan to Tottenham by Terry Venables during the 1988-89 season, but he did enough to secure a permanent move at the end of that campaign. Venables had known the young former Spanish under-21 international from his time at Barcelona, and he was confident he could cope with the English game. Naeem had to wait until the turn of the year before starting in the first team, but he impressed the White Hart Lane crowd with his array of passing and close control. The FA Cup run of 1991 saw him start to deliver in the big games, putting Spurs back into the match against Notts County in the 6th round and having the unenviable task of replacing the injured Paul Gascoigne in the final. But along with his teammates, he showed guile and spirit to see Tottenham through to victory. Perhaps his single most impressive moment came 2 years later at Main Road in the FA Cup quarter-final against Manchester City. Naeem scored a hat-trick to seal a fine 4-2 win, showing once again that Spurs could raise their game when the cup competitions come round. The 1992-93 season would be Naeem's last in England before he returned to Spain to play for Real Zaragoza. But the Spurs fans, who used to bow to his skills from the terraces, still considered him their own, as he beat David Seaman from the halfway line to win the Cup Winners' Cup for Zaragoza against Arsenal in 1995. Terry Venables had a tough time finding an ideal goalkeeper after taking over at Tottenham. That was until he brought Erik Thorstvedt to the club. The tall Norwegian overcame an unsure debut in front of the live TV cameras in January 1989 to make his mark on the English game, providing assurance to a Spurs defence famous for its generosity. The second half of the 1988-89 season saw Tottenham rise to 6th, having been bottom during the opening weeks, and the Torsfett effect was even more apparent in the following year, as the team finished 3rd in 1990, unfortunately deprived of European football because of the ban on English clubs. This amiable yet commanding keeper's search for honours would be realised in 1991, as Tottenham won the FA Cup against Nottingham Forest at Wembley, having disposed of North London rivals Arsenal a month earlier, and Torsfett made crucial saves at key times in both games. The emergence of Ian Walker through the Spurs ranks started to disrupt Torsfett's appearances in the first team, and he eventually left White Hart Lane in 1994 to become a respected goalkeeping coach. In the summer of 1989, England goal-scoring hero Gary Lineker phoned Terry Venables. For Lineker, it was time to return from Barcelona. He was desperate to return to form ahead of the 1990 World Cup. For Spurs fans, this was music to their ears, as Lineker struck up an instant understanding with Paul Gascoigne. Having gone the first 6 matches without a goal, there was no stopping Lineker after that, as he rattled them in with customary ease throughout his Tottenham career. The Leicester-born marksman finished the 1989-90 season with a flurry of goals, and as he hoped, he went on to have another successful World Cup in Italy. The following season brought more goals, but more tellingly, his first and only trophy in domestic football. Winning the FA Cup against Nottingham Forest in 1991 not only brought great joy to him, but immense relief, having seen a penalty saved during that match. The 91-92 campaign saw Lineker finish as the league's top scorer, and that would be his last season in England. He made the decision to end his career in Japan and received a heroic send-off from Spurs and opposition fans alike, keen to recognise a man who holds a special place in football history. Plenty of talk about Steve Sedgley coming to Tottenham well before he finally did so in the summer of 1989. Making his debut at home to Luton on the opening day of the season, Sedgley was renowned for his off-field humour and his versatility on it. Starting Spurs life as a midfielder, his dogged style allowed the flair players the freedom to do their thing. Midway through the 1989-90 campaign, injuries forced Terry Venables into playing Sedgley at centre-back, and that proved an inspired move, as alongside Gary Mabbutt, he showed calmness and the ability to bring the ball out of defence. Sedgley helped Spurs finish 3rd that season, but it was in the following year that the silverware came back, as the FA Cup returned to White Hart Lane. Having been a non-playing substitute for Coventry 4 years earlier, ironically against Spurs, Sedgley now had a Cup winners' medal he knew was well earned, as Nottingham Forest were beaten 2-1. The rest of his Tottenham career was spent moving to and fro from defence back to midfield before he was sold by Ossie Ardiles in 1994 to Wolves. signed from Southend. After initially impressing on loan, Justin Edinburgh joined Tottenham in 1990 for a bargain fee of £150,000. Player plucked from a side with whom he just helped gain promotion to the third division, but he was seen as a replacement for veteran Pat van den Houw. He made his competitive debut sooner than expected. Injuries led to him being drafted in from the reserves to play in a League Cup tie against Hartlepool, and the young defender stepped into the first team to produce a confident, assured display. The long-term absence of Terry Fenwick saw Van den Houw moved across to right-back, and Edinburgh was installed as the regular at left-back. A season of impressive displays from this quick-thinking attacking fullback culminated in an appearance in the FA Cup final victory of 1991 against Nottingham Forest. Not bad for a player who 12 months previously had been playing in the 4th division. Edinburgh also went on to pick up a League Cup winners' medal despite being sent off in the final. A loyal servant to Tottenham, Edinburgh brought a decade-long career at White Hart Lane to an end when he moved to Portsmouth in 2000. Tottenham coaching staff thought they had a gem on their hands when a teenager called Ian Walker arrived at the club, showing all the goalkeeping skills of his father, Mike. With reflexes as good as any other young keeper, Walker was gradually groomed as the successor to Eric Torsfet at White Hart Lane, making his debut in 1991 at Norwich, as Terry Venables rested players ahead of the FA Cup semi-final showdown with Arsenal. Having had a taste of first-team action, this confident young man had a run of games in the following season in Torsfet's absence through injury, and he started to show the Spurs fans that promise can be realised quickly. By the mid-90s, Walker was Tottenham's number one, and he had earned a handful of England caps, surpassing the achievements of his proud dad. Using martial arts to help in his concentration and reaction times, he enjoyed several seasons of personal success, just missing out on Wembley in 1995 and 99 at the FA Cup semi-final stage. But silverware finally came Walker's and Tottenham's way with the 1999 League Cup triumph. The arrival of Neil Sullivan in the year 2000 brought competition to a place that fits only one, and needing guaranteed first-team football, Walker left at the end of the season in 2001 for Leicester City. But he remains a player that can return to White Hart Lane, guaranteed a good reception by a crowd who still consider him one of their own. Having completed just one full season in the professional game, even Darren Anderton himself was shocked when Tottenham took him to North London from Portsmouth for almost £2 million. This quiet, modest midfielder struggled to find his feet at first, but Terry Venables kept faith with him and he was repaid as Anderton recaptured the form that had prompted Spurs to buy him in the first place. An attacking midfielder who, when injury-free, could be an exhilarating sight with the ability to glide past opponents as well as delivering pinpoint crosses. In recent seasons, Anderton has played in a more central role, using his skill and vision to dictate play. Industrious in his work rate, And a real team player, he also weighed in with a fair share of spectacular goals. But unfortunately, his proneness to injury meant Anderton's career stuttered. But his talent was recognised by club and country. And acclaimed performances for England at Euro 96 and France 98 underlined his ability on the biggest of stages. Having played in 3 FA Cup semi-finals, Darren never made it all the way to a final, perhaps an injustice for a player of his quality. But a hero at White Hart Lane already, Spurs fans can only wonder what the club and the man might have achieved were it not for those injuries. As a boy, Teddy Sheringham was a Spurs fan, so nothing was going to stop him realising his dream of pulling on the famous white shirt when Terry Venables sought to bring him to the club in 1992 from Nottingham Forest. In his first season at White Hart Lane, he struck up an instinctive understanding with rising young stars Darren Anderton and Nicky Barmby, and he would finish the 92-93 campaign as the Premier League's first top goal scorer. Despite a lack of pace, Sheringham fast gained a reputation as the thinking man's forward, intelligently bringing teammates into play as well as finding the net on a regular basis. His most productive spell came with Jurgen Klinsmann's arrival at Tottenham, the two of them instantly hitting it off, making and scoring goals to rival any partnership in the country. Sheringham's Spurs career coincided with blossoming England honours, peaking at Euro 96 when his partnership with Alan Shearer helped to terrorise international defences. In 1997, Sheringham dropped a bombshell. He wanted to leave Tottenham and joined Manchester United to pursue the trophies that he felt he needed to win. Win them he did, before Glenn Hoddle brought him back to White Hart Lane on a free transfer in 2001. The influential forward was Hoddle's presence on the field, guiding the club's promising youngsters. But after 2 seasons back, the board felt that qualifying for Europe was the only justification for retaining Sheringham's services. And having failed, he controversially left Tottenham for the second time. Still, many fans believe he will return again one day as manager. Tottenham manager Terry Venables had to fend off attention from Manchester United and Alex Ferguson to seal the signature of Nicky Barmby, even while the promising young midfielder was excelling at the FA's school at Lilleshall. He was gaining admirers and attracting interest from many quarters. At Spurs, he quickly progressed through the youth and reserve teams and made a senior debut in 1992. It didn't take him long to cement his place in the first team and went on to become an exciting part of an ambitious five-man attack, including the talents of Anderton, Dumitrescu, Sheringham and Klinsmann. A versatile attacking player, able to play anywhere in midfield, as well as in his more preferred position up front. Barmby was also good with his head, and he had two good feet, often picking up goals with an uncanny ability to arrive late in the box to convert chances. These qualities soon saw him break into the England squad, where he's always performed well, often on the problematic left side. Since leaving Tottenham, Barmby went on to have spells at Middlesbrough, Everton, Liverpool and Leeds, but it was surely at Spurs that his talents shone brightest. Solskjaer Campbell was another young man who graduated from the FA School of Excellence. But White Hart Lane was where Sol would complete his education. He made an instant impact on the first team when he scored on his Tottenham debut, coming on as a substitute in a 2-1 defeat at Chelsea in December 1992, although he didn't play another game that season. Campbell's increasing involvement in the first team squad saw him grow in confidence, and he quickly became recognised as a player with the potential to go all the way. He was physically blessed with strength and pace, and he had the skill to be able to read the game. He certainly seemed to have all the right attributes to become a top defender. And it wasn't long before the national team also identified Campbell's talent. He was handed his international debut in 1996. Since then, he has established himself as a rock at the heart of the England defence, and at Spurs it was the same story. The club captaincy soon belonged to Campbell, as he went on to become the embodiment of Tottenham Hotspur Football Club, worshipped by the fans who had watched him develop. His Spurs career sadly came to an acrimonious end when he refused to sign a new contract, sparking one of the longest-running transfer sagas ever. To the disbelief of Tottenham fans, Campbell chose to join North London arch-rivals Arsenal. The one-time hero of White Hart Lane will always be remembered, perhaps for his exit rather than his many exploits. Despite making his Tottenham debut in 1993 at the tender age of 16, it wasn't until the 96-97 season that Stephen Carr really made an impact on the Spurs first team. This Irish international defender blossomed under George Graham, missing only one Premiership game in 1998-99. Comfortable playing either as a fullback or wingback, Carr is always looking to support the attack with his foraging bursts forward, using his considerable pace, and he's regarded by many to be the best right wing-back in the league. Due to injury problems, Carr suffered the heartbreak of missing the World Cup in Japan and Korea, where he might have become a big star. But he came back as good as ever, immediately winning back his place in the Spurs team and regaining his spot in the Irish international squad. His consistent top-class performances didn't go unnoticed by the best clubs in Europe. Surely all would be interested in luring Carr away from the lane. But Stephen has been Tottenham through and through, loved by the supporters at White Hart Lane, who would hate to lose another of the club's best players of recent years. Israeli international Ronnie Rosenthal was brought in from Liverpool by manager Ozzy Ardiles as Spurs' 93-94 campaign looked to be heading for calamity. They were slipping places in the league, and with Teddy Sheringham out injured, a forward was needed to change fortunes. After scoring on his debut against Sheffield Wednesday, Rosenthal showed the pace and willingness to help arrest the Tottenham slump, putting some spark back into the team's attacking play. His straightforward, hard-running style caused defences problems, as Spurs stayed up and looked to better times for the following season. As Jerry Francis replaced Ardiles in 1994, Rosenthal was used more as a winger with such a plethora of forwards to choose from. But his most memorable performance came on a night of Cup glory at Southampton, when he came on as a substitute with Spurs already 2 goals down. A thrilling hat-trick swung the game in Tottenham's favour before the Saints were finally humiliated 6-2. Rosenthal's appearances would be sporadic over the following seasons under Francis before a move to Watford in 1997. Having watched superstar Jurgen Klinsmann once again produce the goods at the 1994 World Cup, Chairman Alan Sugar personally lured the German onto his yacht to make him sign for Tottenham. Klinsmann didn't need much persuading. This was a man keen to embrace new experiences in life, and coming to London was the right idea at the right time. The British press were keen to highlight his reputation for winning dubious decisions, but as the season progressed, they had to concede that he was faultless in every respect, on and off the pitch. Spearheading Ozzy Ardiles' 5-man attacking forward line, Klinsmann was in sensational form from day one, making a goal-scoring debut at Sheffield Wednesday and terrorising defences in every match. His partnership with Teddy Sheringham was a natural one from the start. Capable of scoring goals from the spectacular to the sublime, Klinsmann's infectious personality rubbed off on everyone at White Hart Lane, as his appetite for the game never dwindled. As the campaign progressed, Spurs changed managers and found themselves back in the FA Cup, having previously been exiled for a year. Klinsmann almost helped the club to Wembley, as they just failed to make it in the semi-finals. The Germans' last-minute winner at Anfield in the 6th round, though, remains the highlight not only of the season, but of his whole time in England. Having returned to Germany after just 1 year, Christmas came early for Spurs fans in 1997, when Alan Sugar patched up their differences after the first departure, and Klinsmann came back. Spurs were struggling to stay in the Premier League, but safety was secured against Wimbledon in the penultimate match, Klinsmann hitting 4 goals to place himself in Spurs folklore all over again. Jerry Francis signed promising young striker Chris Armstrong in 1995 from Crystal Palace. The Tottenham manager had drawn comparisons between him and Les Ferdinand, and he was hoping he would do for Spurs what Ferdinand had done for QPR. Armstrong arrived from Palace with a growing reputation as a top-class striker, and it was this potential that prompted Spurs to pay £4.5 million for his services. After the departure of Jurgen Klinsmann, there was a void left at White Hart Lane, and it was the unenviable task of Armstrong to try and fill it. After initially struggling, he hit form and began to forge an impressive partnership with Teddy Sheringham, giving Tottenham a threatening-looking attack. A pacey striker, good in the air, complementing the skill and vision of his partner, and Armstrong was soon notching up the goals. Unfortunately, his habit of picking up injuries led to some sporadic form, although he did play a key part in Tottenham's League Cup success in 1999. Always feeling he had more to do to win the fans over, and not content with reserve team life, Armstrong left Spurs in the summer of 2002 on a free transfer to Bolton Wanderers. Young Norwegian striker Stefan Iversen gave up Champions League football to join Tottenham in December 1996, his last match for Rosenborg, playing victoriously in the San Siro against Milan. Manager Jerry Francis beat off plenty of other top clubs to win the race for his signature, and on the pitch, Iversen started to show that his potential could be realised. Regarded as Jurgen Klinsmann Mark II, Iversen was unlucky to suffer from various injuries, but his best spell came under George Graham in 1998-99, influential throughout Spurs' victorious League Cup campaign. Always an aerial threat, and with an eye for the spectacular finish, Iversen's international career with Norway was flourishing in tandem with his time at White Hart Lane. At Euro 2000, he was one of their few stars to shine. Having to settle for rotation up front with the likes of Les Ferdinand, Chris Armstrong, Sergei Rebrov and the returning Teddy Sheringham, he found it hard to get back into the first-team picture. And with Glenn Hoddle unable to guarantee him a starting place, in the summer of 2003, Iversen joined newly promoted Wolves on a free transfer. Flamboyant Frenchman David Ginola arrived at White Hart Lane in 1997, having already showcased his tremendous skills in England at Newcastle United. The left-winger quickly became a crowd favourite, treating the Tottenham faithful to some dazzling displays of Gallic flair and trickery. At his best, Ginola was simply in a class of his own, unrivalled with the ball at his feet. Gifted with tremendous poise and ball control, he could effortlessly embarrass defenders, gliding past them in a way that only a stylish Frenchman could do. Ginola's crowd-pleasing style was complemented with a fair share of goals, 22 in 127 appearances in all, many of which were simply breathtaking. His finest season came in 1998-99, when a string of inspirational performances helped take Tottenham to the semi-finals of the FA Cup and helped them to lift the League Cup. Ginola's individual contribution that year was largely responsible for the team's success, and he was rewarded accordingly as the PFA and Football Writers' Player of the Year. The arrival of new boss George Graham and his liking for a more defence-orientated team spelt the end of Ginola's Tottenham career, but he will long be remembered as one of the most gifted and most popular players ever to have entertained the White Hart Lane crowds. Les Ferdinand's boyhood dreams came true when in 1997 he sealed a move from Newcastle United to Tottenham Hotspur, the club he'd supported as a youngster. He didn't take much persuading to return to the city where he'd grown up, and he relished the opportunity to pull on the famous white shirt, filling the position vacated by Manchester United-bound Teddy Sheringham. Having already made his name at Queen's Park Rangers and Newcastle, Ferdinand had become one of the country's best strikers, picking up 17 England caps. A powerful man, superb in the air, and a great target man to spearhead any attack. But he was also gifted with the ball at his feet. He could run at defences and had a tremendous shot in both feet. Bravery is not something you could accuse Ferdinand of lacking. He was always 100% committed to any cause and never shied away from a challenge. Unfortunately, injuries often prevented Les from producing his best form for Spurs, though his professionalism and desire to play ensured he kept himself in the top shape possible. He played in 2 FA Cup semi-finals for Spurs and also 2 League Cup finals, picking up a winner's medal in the victory over Leicester City. Stefan Freund, one of the players brought in by George Graham to add strength and experience to midfield. He had played at the highest level, the proud owner of both a European Cup winners' medal from his time with Borussia Dortmund and a winners' medal from Euro '96 as part of the perpetually strong German national side. The medal-winning habit followed Freund to White Hart Lane as he played in the 1999 Worthington League Cup winning side just a few months after his arrival. His combative style of play and his motivational influence also made him a crowd favourite. Perhaps he's most fondly remembered because of his inability to score in his time at Tottenham, frequently goaded in jest by the Spurs fans to try his luck as the opportunity arose. With the arrival of Glenn Hoddle in 2001, Freund started to show he wasn't just a ball winner as his passing talent began to shine, but his season sadly ended in a broken leg sustained in the League Cup semi-final at Chelsea, and that denied him his place in the final at Cardiff. With his contract expiring at the end of 2003, the club wanted to reduce the average age of the squad, and he was reluctantly told he could leave, heading back to Germany and Kaiserslautern. The truth is, though, he never really wanted to go and would have willingly stayed at White Hart Lane for the rest of his career, something the fans would have been pretty happy about too. Of all the blossoming young talent at White Hart Lane at the turn of the millennium, the most promising was perhaps Ledley King. Brought through the Spurs youth ranks, King first got his chance in the first team under George Graham in a holding midfield role, but the arrival of Glenn Hoddle brought a change to defence where the manager thought he would best be suited. Calm on the ball and possessing deceptive pace, King has the instinctive ability to read the game, assets which saw him win a first England cap at an early stage in his career against Italy in 2002. Seen as the natural successor to the defected Sol Campbell, Spurs fans hope King will be around for years to come and that more international honours will eventually follow. The emergence of Simon Davies has been one of the pluses for Tottenham of recent years. He arrived from Peterborough United on New Year's Eve in 1999 as part of a double signing with Matthew Etherington, and Davies has progressed in leaps and bounds. An impressive debut at Anfield against Liverpool signalled his potential as he produced a display unfazed by his surroundings. It was in the FA Cup that he really announced his arrival on the first team scene, coming on as a sub in the 5th round against Stockport County and bagging a brace to win the game for Spurs. Primarily a right-sided attacking midfielder, though versatile enough to play in a number of roles, Davies quickly became an integral part of the Spurs team. Wherever he plays, Davies is always a threat to score himself and a source of much of the team's creativity, setting up chances for others. In 2002, his fledgling career got another boost when his national coach Mark Hughes gave the young Welshman his first international cap against the Ukraine. His impact at that level has been equally impressive. He's become a regular in a vastly improved Welsh team. The highlight so far, getting his name on the score sheet as Wales recorded a sensational win over Italy in a Euro 2004 qualifier. His rise to prominence has brought interest from many other big clubs, but for the meantime at least, White Hart Lane is where Davies will showcase his considerable talent. As free transfers go, Neil Sullivan's as good as you can get. George Graham snapped him up from relegated Wimbledon in 2000. Many were left guessing who would start the season in goal, Sullivan or the previous regular Ian Walker. It was the new arrival that got the nod, and he'd go on to win the fans' choice as Player of the Year by the end of that campaign. In the FA Cup, Sullivan was particularly inspirational, as Spurs almost made it to Cardiff, only losing out at the semi-final stage to North London rivals Arsenal. With many former Wimbledon players around him and goalkeeping coach Hans Sagers, a former Don, Sullivan settled in well at White Hart Lane, providing steadiness and authority to complement his excellent shot-stopping talent. He remained first choice with the arrival of Glenn Hoddle, but injury gave Casey Keller his chance at the tail end of the 2001-02 season, and the American kept his place from then on. Sullivan was unable to settle for life in the reserves, but landed a dream move to join the Chelsea Russian Revolution in the summer of 2003, now bidding for the #1 spot at Stamford Bridge. Tottenham fans may never quite know how to summarise Sergei Rebrov's spell at the club. He arrived in 2000 as the club's record signing a hefty £11 million, and he arrived with a reputation as one of Europe's hottest striking properties after his exploits in the Champions League for Dynamo Kiev. Under George Graham, Rebrov's opening months showed high promise. He displayed technique, creativity and goal-scoring ability from many angles. The Ukrainian's best moments came in the FA Cup. He got 3 goals on the route to the semi-final, and his brace at West Ham in the 6th round remains a lasting memory. Stifled slightly by Graham's tactics, Rebrov was happy to see him replaced by Glenn Hoddle, a man famed for backing flair players. But then it all started to go wrong. He was starved of first-team opportunities, confidence dipped, and outspoken remarks took Rebrov to the point of no return under Hoddle, and a man who the Spurs fans had chanted for week in, week out, found his spell at White Hart Lane a short one. When it became clear that Gus Poyet had no future at Chelsea, Glenn Hoddle moved quickly to snap him up for £1.5 million in the summer of 2001. With a host of young players coming through the Spurs ranks, Poyet was seen as the ideal man with experience to have around. The Uruguayan also possessed the knack of scoring goals from midfield, proving that even at the age of 34, he had lots to offer the English game. Indeed, Poyet ended his first season with 14 goals, proving pivotal as Spurs made it all the way to the final in the League Cup and reached the quarter-final stages of the FA Cup. One of the most likeable personalities off the pitch, Poyet always seems to be a step ahead on it, knowing where he's going to pass the ball before it arrives. As good in the air as any striker, he provides a real threat going forward, and he knows his defensive duties too. Now in his 3rd season at White Hart Lane, it could be his last, as retirement does beckon. But Poyet's appetite for the game remains undiminished, serving as an example to all those around him. So what a lineup of talent to grace the FA Cup or any other competition. The men who've helped create the legend of Tottenham Hotspur. We hope you've enjoyed it. From us all, goodbye for now.